welcome. I understand we have a really nice large audience today. Certainly, as Amy said, if you have questions, send them into chat. We'll try and deal with them either before or I should say during or after the session as much as we can. Our topic today is improving organizational efficiency, the benefits of internal audit. And, I think we just wanted to spend a little time today really highlighting some of the things that we've seen are really the value of an internal audit, and maybe even bringing out in maybe somewhat of a high level fashion some thoughts and ideas and things that we've seen that have been of value, and how internal audit really fits into organizational risk management and structure. I think it's an area that really can encompass a lot of different potential work, projects, activities, and I think to some extent the challenge is making sure we all articulate the value that internal audit can bring to an organization. So we'll spend a few minutes today on that, and hopefully it'll give you a couple little insights for you to take home. My name is Scott Sissel. I'm the partner in charge of internal audit services for the firm. I'm based in Minneapolis. I have 30 plus years of experience, and my focus really is in the healthcare and health insurance area, although I have touched on several other industries in my career. So to the extent I talk today, and I may focus a couple of my comments, I'll probably give examples that are a little bit more in my industry realm. With that, I'll let Audrey give a quick introduction of herself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Audrey Donovan. I'm Senior Manager at Eide Bailly, and I'll be the other co-presenter today on our webinar. I am currently a performance auditor and also an internal auditor for Eide Bailly. I want to say that I've been a performance auditor now for going on 14 years. I started my career as the Deputy Director for the City and County of Denver as a performance auditor under the former elected auditor Gallagher, who was previously served 38 years as a Colorado State Senator. So there was a lot of public policy information that transpired, including running legislation at the Capitol. But prior to joining local government, I was also an internal auditor for Big Four, so Ernst & Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers. I've had quite the lengthy career and really wanted to bring that back to government, which is where I'm at now with Eide Bailly, and really focusing on having a legitimate opportunity for significant impact in government and public policy. So I'll go ahead and turn that back over to Scott.
Thanks, Audrey. Yes, and I should mention also that as Audrey mentioned, she's worked both in the consulting side and also in the other side of the table, working actually for organizations and companies. And I bring somewhat similar experience working with some large and small companies throughout. So hopefully we can bring you some perspectives today. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to try and cover a few things. First of all, define internal audit, because I think that always helps bring everyone back to what internal audit is and potentially what value can bring. Talk a little bit about the challenges we all face, not only within internal audit, but what businesses are challenged with today. Talk a little bit about the various types of audits, and then maybe focus a little bit on the value of an internal audit. I'm going to transition it over to Audrey. She's going to talk a little bit about performance auditing, operational auditing, and also give you a few examples of some what I would term emerging areas of interest, although some of these probably have been talked about for the last few years. Let's start with the definition of internal audit. I always think it's interesting for those who don't see it. This definition often, and this is actually by definition by the Institute of Internal Auditors. And we've highlighted a couple key words here. Internal auditing is an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organization's operations. So from that perspective too, internal audit's role is consulting oriented, and it's really, by definition, by mission, to add value to an organization. In addition to that, it goes on to say that it helps an organization accomplish its objectives by a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance. And I think a lot of people equate internal audit with control or controls, and oftentimes financial controls. But I think Audrey will talk about even more specifically some of the other areas we go into. I'll talk a little bit about risk management and governance and the importance of those functions, and the fact that internal audit does play a role in both of those activities. A couple other thoughts on internal audit, just kind of definitional. Risk is anything that can prevent the organization from meeting its objectives. Internal controls are actions taken to manage or mitigate risk and thereby increase the likelihood of meeting objectives. So not necessarily a financial control, not necessarily a reconciliation. It's those type of controls that are put in place to mitigate risk. So when you get outside the financial related areas, there are controls that should or could or should be in place, and that can be monitored by an internal audit function. And then of course, residual risk is what the level of risk remaining after you assess controls and the effectiveness of those controls in operation. Internal audit is subject to a framework, International Professional Practices Framework in particular, as well as international standards for professional practice of the internal audit function are all aspects of the control that's in place. The other thing I'd like to mention here too is that internal audit really encompasses what's called the 3 lines of defense. And really the first 2 lines are operational management, risk management, and compliance functions, which I will talk about a couple of these a little bit later, as well as the independent and objective assurance and advice on governance and risk management. So those elements are all really part of the 3 lines of defense that internal audit does provide to an organization. So what kind of challenges do businesses face, and frankly, internal audit departments face? Regulations. Quite frankly, a lot of work we do is in industries such as healthcare, government, banking, gaming industry, insurance, highly regulated industries, and all are subject to fairly significant amount of compliance requirements. Those tend to be things that organizations are dealing with every day. Sometimes they're maybe not at the forefront, but to the extent that some of these compliance requirements are not being met could create some fairly significant concerns or issues to an organization. So internal audit can certainly help an organization manage those compliance requirements, manage the controls around them, monitor what's happening with respect to the regulations and compliance. Certainly an area of value, maybe not quite as quantifiable as other areas, but certainly an area of value. We're really in the middle of changing business conditions. And as we did this presentation going back a year ago, we were all talking about the remote workforce, what was going to happen to the economy, the environment, those sort of things, and the risks that could occur. Now we're really kind of one step further, and most organizations are either in the middle, maybe fairly far along, or still working through what does the future of the workplace look like from a remote perspective. Obviously, some organizations have come out with their thoughts and policies, others are developing them. But to some extent, there's going to be a need to understand what those policies are and understand how each organization is going to monitor the workforce, and is it meeting the workforce needs, is it meeting the business's needs, etc. Clearly, there's a high level of social and environmental changes occurring. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Those all have to be layered into how businesses operate. And it's certainly an emerging area that internal audit can play into. Interestingly enough, I think a year ago, March, April, a lot of us were concerned about the economic impact and whether the unemployment would be as severely impacting a lot of individuals. Where we are today, I think as we look forward, most businesses are now concerned about the ability to retain and recruit talent to their organization. So internal audit is challenged with that, but so is businesses. And does this mean that they have to look at things differently? Do they have to structure their operations differently? Do they have such resource constraints that's putting a lot of pressure on their control structure? All those things, are things that we're facing now, will continue to face, I think, in the next several years. Then, of course, continued complexity, technology, cyber risk, really right, we're kind of in the middle of some really significant things happening in those areas as well. And what is internal audit's role, and how can internal audit add value to an organization when they're trying to manage these type of risks? Value of internal audit, I think I touched on these to some extent already. A lot of these really come right out of IIA has put together an internal audit assessment tool for audit committees, and so I want to give them some level of credit around some of the things that should be looked at and really create value that internal audit can bring. But clearly, internal audit can help management focus on key responsibilities. They can help them focus on strategy. They can help them better identify and assess and manage risk. Day-to-day activities for anyone can be overwhelming, and to have a function in an organization that can help management really kind of keep on track and make sure they're thinking about the most significant risks from a control perspective on a day-to-day basis is really important. Assessing opportunities, as we talked about all these business changes, internal audit can play a role in identifying different ways to do things, better ways to do things, or things that maybe just have evolved over time and aren't the most effective or efficient way to do business and to develop a control structure. Other things that kind of ties into operating efficiencies, ethics, promoting ethics, always an important area. Internal audit can certainly bring expertise to certain areas of the organization, help management sort through efficiencies and effectiveness. And then along with, as I mentioned earlier, some of the regulatory changes that continue to occur. This really kind of highlights several kind of buckets that we've looked at that can provide areas of opportunity and value. I'm going to talk a little bit about risk assessment, talk a little bit about maybe new business or processes or industry specific skills. Audrey's going to talk about performance audits in particular and operational audits. Ultimately, value it should be defined using some sort of mechanism. Recently read an article in Internal Audit magazine that talked about monetary and non-monetary benefits and controllable costs. Obviously, to the extent internal audit identifies specific improvement or gaps, things such as duplicate AP payments, you can quantify some of those. The non-monetary benefits become more of a challenge, but generally can be quantified if you're identifying operational efficiencies. If you tackle an area of compliance that could create significant regulatory reputational risk or compliance fines and penalties, those are things that can at least be monitored, tracked, and measured in a more broader sense. So keep that in mind as you assess your own function on an annual basis, because there are ways that you can continue to let other stakeholders know of the value you do bring each year. Let's talk a little bit about risk management. I think the first thing I'd like to point out is that, and I think sometimes there's a little bit of confusion. Enterprise risk management is not necessarily, or probably should not be solely an internal audit function. Really, that's a management function. You see chief risk officers, and the reason it needs to be a management function is because of the need to have that broad business perspective of everything that's happening with an organization, really to develop a enterprise risk management function that's effective. Having said that, within internal audit, we should be doing some sort of risk assessment, and we should be working with management on the risk assessment. And that risk assessment really should be, to some extent, integrated with what happens with the organization from a risk assessment process. And it's important that it is, so that truly when an internal audit function determines what their plan is for the next year, 3 years, et cetera, that it's really in line and synced up with what management believes are significant risks. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you solely rely on management to say, here's our risk, here's where you should work. I mean, I think it's a two-way street. You know, if you identify and see risk areas or emerging risk areas, it's important to bring those to management's attention and build those into your plan. But I think where there's really a lot of values is you're working hand in hand on a risk assessment process, your ability to help structure the process, your the ability of internal audit to help manage the process of developing and identifying key risks, and then really monitoring it as on a go-forward basis, and really linking in some of the work you do to some of those key risks that as an organization have been identified as areas of importance. It can be an overwhelming task, though. This is just one pictorial of all the potential risks that are out there. And I think and this is not to say that this is the only way to look at the universe of risks, but obviously there are a lot of them, and to monitor, to categorize, assess, and monitor is a significant task. So I think internal audit playing a key role at the table in the overall risk assessment can really add value to an organization. Going to hit just a couple areas of potential value and to think about as you execute on your plans for the year, develop your plans, I should say. First couple items, I think areas that we've seen where there maybe is hidden risks, and where maybe there isn't as much transparency, is when an organization gets involved in either new businesses or ventures that maybe isn't necessarily tied into their core structure, and as a result, they maybe aren't as comfortable with what is happening there. They may be not as comfortable with some of the technical or compliance requirements, but they do believe it fits into their overall business philosophy and mission and vision. And so those are areas that I think there's a lot of value to plug in, and I think there's a fair amount of risk, because oftentimes you don't know what you don't know. And I think it's really helpful to think about that when you do see some changes in business structure, new ventures, businesses. Remote locations, that meaning probably has changed here in the last year or two, but remote locations here really mean if an organization is largely US domicile and they have foreign operations, or they're largely based in Denver, Colorado, but they have operations in New York or California. Again, even though we're all interconnected, sometimes having new business activities, not necessarily where they're housed, can create some concerns or issues. I talked a little bit about where we may be headed from a resource constraint perspective, and that can trigger organizational structural changes. Oftentimes, or a concern, I should say, is that as organizational structure changes, they don't think about the control structure that sits within the organization, and as a result, certain things that maybe were occurring in the past are no longer occurring. So that's another area that I think you can really fit in well on, is to look at those changes. Is there any gaps? If there is gaps, how do you restructure the control environment in order to address those gaps? Cultural and employee matters. Certainly in the last year, expectations around organizational culture, diversity and inclusion, remote workforce, all those have really created some new dynamics, and so it's important to understand how an organization is responding to those, and are they responding appropriately and timely. Other things I've talked about already: financial reporting, regulatory close, reporting close process, always very significant areas. Asset integrity and maintenance, and that could be construction activities, that could be software, technology changes. All those things are areas that can create a fair amount of risk, and are really kind of interesting and high value places to fit in. And then along with some of the other more traditional areas, and I added a little note at the bottom: more outsourcing. So to the extent organizations looked to outsourcing because of resource constraints, obviously there's a whole aspect of vendor management that you should always think about, particularly as they enter into some of these new arrangements, because that's where some of the control risks may initiate in the early stages of a working relationship. A couple other thoughts. I call them emerging areas. I'm not so sure some of these are as emerging anymore, but data analytics, and I got a few slides later on, I'll talk about that. That really is where a lot of activities are heading, whether you're in the finance function, whether you're in internal audit or other compliance areas, and it's something to really invest time in. And I think we've done some webinars on this. A lot of organizations do. How best to use data analytics. Do you have all the tools available in training? So something really to keep in mind, because I think that can really help build some level of continuous auditing, which I think a lot of stakeholders are looking to. Industry specific risks are certainly always going to be out there. I could talk about healthcare for hours about the different things that from a compliance and regulatory standpoint that are challenging for management, challenging to stay on top of and continue to change. Even with the pandemic and the use of telehealth, those are type of things that have created really new and emerging risks in those areas. Data security and governance. Interestingly enough, I was reading something by the National Association of Corporate Directors, and they mentioned that only 2% of new board directors have background in or skills in cybersecurity. And then they went on to talk about some of the issues around too high level discussions, messaging for management being too overconfident and reassuring, and not really a follow-up process around any gaps or any real robust discussion around gaps in data security and governance. So even in this day and age, there's still work to be done there. Maybe make a comment or two about ESG, and I'm sure most of you have heard about it, environmental, social, and governance mandate. Right now, many companies have started to take steps forward around disclosures around what they are doing in these areas. It's not required yet. Certainly some of the public companies have started to move down that path. There's clearly a heightened sense of awareness around things like climate change, natural resources, worker safety and standards, executive and board composition and hiring practices. So it's an area that I think as organizations do move forward and doing more around disclosing what they're doing in these areas, and in the business world and consumers look to those companies to understand what they are doing in these areas, this becomes more important. There's certainly things that from an internal audit standpoint that can be built into your plan to kind of assess what the reporting looks like. Is it accurate? What kind of policies and procedures are put in place, and is there a plan and policies in place to address these type of emerging concerns? So something a little bit newer, something to think about. It's again an area that in the last probably 6 months there's a lot written on it. Talk a little bit about culture audit, and to some extent this ties into anything you may do around ESG as well. Culture audits is study and examination of an organization's cultural characteristics. So it's going to touch on things like organization's assumptions, norms, philosophy, and values. And it's really meant to determine whether they are supporting the vision and mission of the organization. So again, it can deal with ethics. That's usually what we think about, but it can deal with things like their culture towards how they treat their employees, their social norms, their view towards the environment, their quality and customer service culture. All those things can somewhat tie into the question of culture and culture audits. Culture audits, I will tell you on the front end, they are a challenge because they're very subjective, and they often deal with very soft controls. We typically like to look at a couple lenses when we look at it, and really the lenses are from the employee side and from the manager side, if you will. What are the employees saying? What are the managers doing? And so oftentimes you can build this into any other project audit you have to get that feedback, but you can also kind of directly look at what happens, really on a day-to-day basis. Are managers really building in that thought process around whatever type of cultural attitude you're trying to understand? For instance, customer service. Is that an important part of daily, weekly, monthly meetings? Does top management stress that? Are there customer satisfaction surveys that occur frequently, and the feedback is reported on and monitored and tracked? Is it part of the training program? So there are things that can be reviewed and audited. It's really just a matter of understanding what those processes and procedures are and making sure that those things are in place, supplemented by feedback from these groups to understand whether they believe that is moving forward and appropriately, timely, and successfully. As I mentioned, it's complex and ever changing, and there really isn't any standard model or program that you can follow. It's real important to define the scope, not take on too broad of a scope when you do it. Understand if you're doing it entity-wide, a particular type of concept of culture, and we've got some things shown here, and or is it departmental level, or a specific type of attitude you're looking to understand. So make sure that, again, you've right-sized it and you haven't taken on too much, and you've clearly defined the scope of the project. Data analysis, and auditing. Got just a couple slides on here. Definitionally, it's the process of inspecting, cleansing, transforming, and modeling data with the objective of highlighting meaningful information, suggesting conclusions, and supporting decision making. So pretty broad definition. A little bit further on what we see in this in data analytics. From our perspective, I think what we've seen is the ability to use data analytics in predictive and interpretive relationships. Oftentimes that's building off of what you've seen with historical information and comparing it to current information, whether that be daily, weekly, monthly, trying to understand why things have changed, or merely just comparing that information to identify anomalies. Why did it change? Something's unusual here. That requires some deeper understanding. Deep learning, it really is probably that next step where you're really trying to predict the future in a much more deeper sense. To predict the future, to predict what type of relationships will occur. You can use that in a variety of areas. We typically see it in the financial related areas. I would, suggest really starting slow, starting in that more kind of interpretive relationship, using historical data, trying to identify outliers, maybe using it to do some data mining to identify what happened with unusual information, outliers, as I mentioned here, and really using that, if you can, build a data warehouse so you can build a continuous auditing process around that. Some specifics around data analytics. Right now, I think as people take their first steps into data analytics, these are the areas that we see maybe being most effective and efficient initially, until you get comfortable with it, comfortable with the tools. Certainly you need the training, you need the right tools to do it. But we've seen a lot of really effective processes around payroll, for instance. Understanding, is there duplicate payments being made? Same thing in expenditure disbursements area. Are there unusual hours being worked by individuals? And that you can build off of history, you can build off of parameters you set. On the revenue side of things, similarly, if you have your revenues into a certain revenue system, you certainly can start building out information around revenue denials or write-offs. You can understand a little bit about what type of revenue is being generated by different types of services, products, etc. And you can use that to build out expectations and anomalies from those expectations. So clearly some interesting things there that can be built. Obviously general ledgers, looking for unusual entries, unusual people generating entries, usual names of individuals. A lot of very simple things I think are a really good place to start. And as we mentioned at the bottom, keep it simple at first, get comfortable with it, and then start building from that. And maybe understanding where your stakeholders see the most value. Really, the last thing I'm going to talk about, I think, today before I kick it over to Audrey is data security and governance. This could be a 2-day session really with what's happening out there. Back to my earlier comments about governance. it's important, and I think an area that internal audit can really fit is, in addition to some of these, say, IT auditing you do, is really understand what management's board skills, what type of reporting and monitoring do they do over data security and the risks related to that. Frankly, very simply, do they have a current risk assessment? And, in this day and age, current probably isn't a year old, given what's been happening. It's probably a fairly frequent assessment process. Is there a risk mitigation strategy and plan, including how do you respond to issues around cybersecurity? That probably is something that's extremely important. Always has been important from a public relations perspective, but when you run into situations where your data may be locked up, you have to decide what are the steps, and you have to decide that fairly quickly. And then obviously reporting too. What type of reporting goes up to management and the board, and is the level of reporting adequate to really give those leadership levels appropriate perspective of what is really happening, what type of risks are there. So I think there's some more kind of governance related things that maybe organizations don't always think about that can be of significant value to an organization, and where internal audit can fit in providing a little more value from a strategic standpoint. Oh, sorry, I misled you. I have one other item. I really talked about this, the compliance area, depending on industry. I think the people we've worked with, it seems like it's a never-ending list of compliance risks, new compliance requirements. So to the extent you can help manage or identify the risks, the key risks, maybe rate those risks, and then help monitor those risks. I think while there may not be a direct monetary return, I think it's there's a real ability to help out management of the business in managing these type of risks.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you, Scott. Everyone, this is Audrey Donovan again, Senior Manager for Eide Bailly. Scott is our partner, and he leads our internal audit practice. So he is technically my boss. He resides in Minneapolis. I am in Denver, Colorado. So hopefully I do a great performance here. So it goes on my annual performance review. So let's start with, what is performance auditing and how can I use it to make my operations better? All right. So as you know, I mentioned before, I am a auditor. I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and I've dedicated probably the last 14 years to performance auditing. And when people ask me what I do, simply saying I'm a performance auditor is really a foreign concept to most, and doesn't really elicit a deep conversation or even one of recognition. So although I am proud of what I do as a performance auditor, and what we accomplish is probably one of the most confusing to non-performance auditors. So what I like to say is that basically I am an efficiency expert, and I focus on helping government. And as we go through these slides, I hope you can also see how performance auditing helps to make things less confusing. I know the landscape is so ripe with so many different types and vasts of internal audits out there and performance audits, but really I hope you can see that this type of service, this activity, is really there to focus on helping government. So as I just mentioned, the introduction, we will get into what is performance auditing and operational auditing, internal audit versus performance audit and operational audit. I want to give you that differentiation, and then types of performance audit and internal or operational audit. We have a lot of examples of those, so I do want to spend the bulk of my time there. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with conclusion. All right, so I'm struggling with this. Okay, performance audit. And this is really going to be the most technical slide here, and the one that I preface because I will be reading it. But let me real quick read the definition of a performance audit, because audit standards promulgated by Government Accountability Office, or GAO, are really the basis of what provides the legitimacy for performance auditing in government and the foundational framework. So the definition, quote, an independent examination of a program, function, operation, or the management systems and procedures of a governmental or nonprofit entity to assess whether the entity is achieving economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in the employment of available resources. End quote. Performance auditing is simply an audit aimed at evaluating the measures instituted by management. I can't put it any more simple than that, or the lack of those measures to ensure that 1, resources have been acquired economically, and 2, that they have been utilized efficiently and effectively. That on the flip side of operational audit, or what I typically refer to as business versus government, the Institute of Internal Auditors, or the IIA, defines operational audit as, quote, a systematic process of evaluating an organization's effectiveness, efficiency, and economy of operations under management's control, and reporting to appropriate persons the results of the evaluation along with recommendations for improvement, end quote. So you can quickly see from the GAO and the IIA definitions that performance audit and operational audit are basically the same thing, with a focus on efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. Additionally, and not provided on this slide, but one that is of significant importance is that both of these are performed by independent auditors. All right, so let's talk about economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. How do we determine whether management is operating economically, efficiently, and effectively, or addressing the 3 E's of the engagement? Let's start with economy. Economy really is to determine whether resources are acquired at the right quality, the right quantity, at the right time and place, and at the lowest possible cost. Or said another way, to determine if money was wasted. Secondly is efficiency, and this efficiency is to determine the optimal relationship between output of services or other results and the resources used to produce them. Or said another way, were the best results achieved for the money spent? Lastly, effectiveness, which is to determine whether policy objectives, operational goals, and other intended effects have been achieved. All right, so I'm sharing this slide with you because as a consultant, we get asked the question of what is the difference between a performance or operational audit and an internal audit. We get asked that a lot because the types of engagements or consulting engagements that individuals come to Eide Bailly for, they're a bit confused, either in the vernacular, the types of outcomes they're looking for. So I think this slide is really helpful to help level set what the difference is. Let's start with objective and focus, which is in the audit component column. For performance and operational audits, the objective is really threefold. First, it is to confirm that adequate measures are in place. As we mentioned earlier, management's measures are in place to report on the results of the 3 E's. And we commonly see these in monitoring reports and operational results. These will also include whether the stated standards for the 3 E's are achieved, which we'll get into in a little bit later. Secondly, the audit provides information on whether the measures are adequate or inadequate. So again, we're back to assessing whether or not the measures are accurate, not just that the measures are in alignment with what they should be. And lastly, we identify and explain the effect or impact on the program, operation, and activity, which we'll get into more examples later. But in the event that management's measures are not adequate, which is quite rare, I think twice I've come across this in my career, management really understands their processes, and they are primarily the key resource to understanding the operations. In the event that measures are inadequate, we look to identify the cause or root causes that result in ineffective, inefficient, and uneconomical processes or activities. Specifically, we'd be looking to determine the cause for the variance from intended outcomes or criteria, which we do see quite frequently. The auditor's job is to determine what is responsible for those variances in efficiency from the standard or the average. In addition to identifying the cause of the failed or inadequate measures, it's important to assess the impact or effect, like what really is happening and why do I care, and provide the recommendations for corrective action. An impact evaluation assesses the impact of the inadequate management measures on, say, service delivery, which we'll get into an example here in the next few slides. Impact evaluation will assess the changes that can be attributed to a project, program, or policy, both the intended ones as well as the unintended ones. It seeks to answer the question of how effective a program is at achieving stated goals. So on the flip side, unlike a performance or operational audit, an internal audit is to assess compliance, risk management, governance, and internal controls, which is also a function of management who is ultimately responsible for being in compliance with applicable rules and regulations. To maintain good governance and ensure internal controls are operating as intended is also the focus of the objectives. This takes us to the third row in the audit component column, audit criteria. The criteria for performance auditing starts with an empty page. Each audit or review is planned specifically to reflect what is being evaluated. Programs are not audited on a reoccurring basis. However, over time, some of them will be audited more than once, which is primarily why getting back into consulting has been so great. Is typically within, say, 5 to 8 years, you're going back and re-auditing the same organization, and sometimes multiple times during that time frame to do follow-up work on recommendations for corrective action. So lastly on this table is methodology. Methodology for internal audit is really risk-based versus symptom-based for performance auditing. All right, so this takes us into the examples that I wanted to get into. So we've discussed what performance audit and operational audits are, and we've learned that they both determine whether management is operating economically, efficiently, and effectively. Let's now move into the 4 audit types. This slide that you're seeing here is a list of individual components that make up just one particular audit type. And the GAO, Government Accountability Office, lists the 4 audit types as 1, program effectiveness, 2, internal controls, 3, compliance, and 4, prospective analysis. So I'll focus on the first one here, and then the next slide I'll get into the others. Let me quickly give you an example of what program effectiveness audit is, and then I'll get into these individual components. A program effectiveness audit determines whether a program is achieving at the highest level the program's mission, vision, goals, and objectives. An example is one that I was involved with when I was the former deputy director for the city and county of Denver, which is the emergency response audit, or an audit of the emergency 911 system and getting ambulances to people. We were hearing through our risk assessment process that ambulances were getting there late and reporting false times. Long story short, we did this amazing IT data scrub looking at the complete population of 911 calls. In a nutshell, we proved that their numbers were wrong and they were not being as effective as they had reported. But they did make some really significant changes out of the audit. Again, I can't do this justice, but this was the audit that made me realize that auditors can be in the business of saving lives, as this audit's outcome ultimately and legitimately increased emergency response time, leading to lives being saved. But the general outcome improved the effectiveness of getting ambulance services to the people in need. But I do fully believe that performance audits at a basic level can make a life or death impact. Now let's break down the various components that make up that high level program effectiveness audit. Let's start with process evaluation. Process evaluations assess the extent to which a program is operating as intended. These really help stakeholders see how a program's outcome or impact was achieved. An example is a review of, say, staff evaluations in relation to job performance, reviewing how these evaluations are used in terms of job development, raises, and promotions. That brings us to outcome evaluations. These audits focus on difficult questions that ask what happened to program participants and how much of a difference the program made for them. Next is impact evaluations. These will typically assess the changes that can be attributed to a particular project, program, or policy. For example, local program local performing arts complex would conduct an economic impact evaluation on how many jobs are associated with events and operations, or what is the effect of economic activity on employment in local economy. Lastly on this slide is cost benefit and cost effectiveness. For example, the number of traffic inspectors carried out per inspection. I said that backwards. Number of traffic inspections carried out per inspector. All right, so this takes us to the other three types of performance audit, which is internal control, compliance, and perspective analysis. I think a lot of you already know what an internal control type of engagement is, and most, if not all of our engagements have a combination of these, but starting with internal control is whether or not controls are sufficient to achieve goals and objectives. When it comes to performance auditing, an assessment of internal controls and compliance is really important to include. Therefore, it's really important for our auditors to understand internal controls and the related laws and the regulations. An example of internal control performance audit would be, say, an organization's purchasing card program. And this takes us to compliance, which is really to determine whether the program is following law, regulations, contracts, agreements. These are really straightforward, and we're looking at contracts and grants and things like that and determining whether incurred or proposed costs are in compliance. These audits typically have a good solid criteria that we're going to audit against. And then lastly is perspective analysis, which evaluates what might happen in the future and what actions might the program take. These are about looking forward. In the past, these have been traditionally about fiscal sustainability, using different kinds of measures and indicators, which we've seen quite a lot, especially with COVID statistics. Perspective analysis audit objectives really provide analysis or conclusions about what information that is based on the assumptions or the events that may occur in the future, along with possible actions that the entity may take in response to future events. An example of this is special consulting requests that I'm currently working on, which is for a nonprofit entity that's looking to possibly benefit from being a standalone entity from their parent company. And this is really based on perspective analysis of the impact of the mill levy funds that they receive. Another example that is more exciting was a request from a council member to review the police response time in her district. To determine the effect of bringing on 2 additional field officers, based on the analysis that we performed, it was determined that adding 2 additional officers to that specific district dropped the response time from 21 minutes to 16 minutes, or a delta of 5 minutes. Based on the information, we can determine how many officers are needed to reduce response time by 5 minutes and the associated cost. One thing to point out is that this type of audit would likely include most, if not all, the other types of performance auditing to make this an informed decision, such as adjusting a police department staffing, and would likely include a review of local policy. All right, but a couple other audits that are not on here that I wanted to quickly go over. One that Scott mentioned earlier, which was culture auditing, which I want to briefly touch on when it comes to performance auditing. You know, we talk a lot about tone at the top in our field, and tone at the middle is really actually quite important too. So looking at organizational culture audits is another performance audit that has all the components of the other audits built into it. But again, root cause. If agencies are not performing, you are looking at why and how. What is the root cause of the culture and the ripple effect, the negative culture? Then there's this concept of real-time auditing. But again, it is after our tried and true internal audit model. You know, citizens, stakeholders, they don't want you to come in and tell you that the milk has spilt or that the milk is all gone and not to do it again. They really want us in there helping them prevent the milk from being spilt. And so this real-time auditing and the data analytics that Scott mentioned earlier is a big component of that. I think you heard from the examples that most of these performance audits are not exclusively one kind or type. They're typically multiple objectives. And really, they are a byproduct of that higher level program effectiveness audit. So I'll wrap up these various types of performance auditing and get into quickly the potential performance audit topics. So types lead into topics, and we have capital assets, healthcare, human service, police, fire, sheriff, criminal justice. We talked a lot about those in these different scenarios. Capital assets, for example, one approach we would take would be to combine the internal control and the process audit approach. The objective would be, say, to evaluate whether adequate internal controls exist over tracking and recording of capital assets. And from a process perspective, the objective would be to determine practices in place to track and monitor assets under, say, over $5,000 threshold. Operational audit topics, this brings us to our final slide. There are a vast number of topics that we would be able to get into when it comes to operational audits. What we have here first is method before objective, which is quite different for me, but the focus here is on whether management is operating economically, efficiently, and effectively. So that's still the same. So with that in mind, you'll see these examples get into the details first with the method, then followed by the objective. So the first one here is examine employee time records and personnel records. The objective would be to determine if sufficient information is available to maximize the effective use of personnel. The other topics here are all really great examples, but really in good or bad budget times, taxpayers demand accountability from public servants and their government employees, and they're looking for them to be good stewards of their taxpayers' dollars to ensure the money they provide goes to properly fund essential core functions of government. They want to ensure that tax dollars are not only accounted for, but also showing measurable results, which is uber critical to building public trust. So these audits are a way for management to understand how well they're doing in terms of their performance, so that they can make informed decisions about their programs or operations. And these are performed by an independent third party that seeks to understand if the operations and procedures are effectively keeping costs low, using resources effectively, and meeting their objectives. One thing that I want to mention here before I wrap up is evidence and findings. It's really important for auditors to be able to interpret reality. Now, I don't know about you, but my amazing children and I, we have different versions of reality. So really on public policy issues such as homelessness, which the vernacular is changing when it comes to culture. It's now unhoused. So let's be more sensitive. Homeless is now unhoused, which is something we should all consider really in our current and near future audit plans, is including an unhoused performance audit. I know that the one source of criteria in the study here is really to grab that evidence and use the techniques that compel people to make the change to help. And this is an area that really deserves that credit. Anyway, I will go ahead and wrap up here. I don't know if there's any questions, but that concludes my presentation on performance audit, operational audit, and wrapping that back up into internal audit. I appreciate your time and your attendance, and thank you all. Please feel free to reach out to me, find me on LinkedIn, or reach out to me directly at Ide Bailey. Love to hear from you.
Audrey, I think there is one question. We only get about a minute. The question is, can you develop more of the symptoms-based methodology and performance audit? So I think it's kind of going back to, you touched on a little bit, the objectives versus the actual, audit, but.
Right. Performance auditing, thank you for the question. And I remember the slide that came from. Internal audit is results related. Performance audit is symptoms based related. We are looking at results, but we're also looking at the symptoms and wrapping that into there. Happy to get into that discussion with you further if you'd like to reach out.
Well, thank you, Audrey. And I think I'm going to give it back to Amy. Appreciate everyone's attendance today, and certainly there's a lot of ways that that value can be driven from the work you do, and we appreciate attendance.